Thank you. Thank you so much, Wayne. I mean, the normal way one begins these is asking whether you can hear me, because I can't see myself, which is not. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. This is Medard. I can hear you
I'm
clearly, and I can also see you.
wonderful. I'm in the enviable position of not being able to see myself, but so long as you can see me, that's well and good. Thank you, Medard, for having us here again. I think from the very start of our relationship, I've been I've been really awed by the range of the geographical range and the thematic range of these conferences and laboratories, and also the way that you've been able to integrate actual hands-on thinking into what could possibly be doing at the United Nations level. And it's always a particular privilege to do so with Pragati, because as you mentioned, Wayne, her history with the evolution of the Sustainable Development Goals and of environment within the UN, the rethinking that began in 1992, had a major punctuation point in 2005, and finally took off in 2015, is something fairly unrivaled in our organization. I wanted to ask all of us for a moment just to cast our mind a year ago. Let's think of June the 22nd, 2019. And if someone had come to you at that point and said, look, we are going to be confronted with a crisis which is so sweeping in its magnitude, so devastating in its impact, destroy economies, it's going to destroy or diminish human lives, lead to accusations and counter accusations between nations. It's going to shift policies by nations against other nations and against their own citizens. It's going to be completely, but it's going to be invisible. If someone had come to you a year ago and said, what could that danger be? And if you had reflected upon it, the suggestion would be that all of us would have said climate change. Today, on June the 22nd, 2020, we have two options. It could be COVID-19 or it could be climate change. Because both of them have attributes that I tried to summarize a little while ago. A danger that we realize if we stop and think about it, or more grotesquely, we realize if we ourselves or those for whom we care are affected by it. And so when you began this particular conversation by linking the pandemic with climate, it's something which can be done at various levels. And I know there are going to be scientific levels where you can prove this, and I'm sure that Pragati will address these. But I wanted to also focus upon the impact on us about our sheer vulnerability as human beings. Later this week on Friday, we will observe or commemorate, or I dare say celebrate, the 75th anniversary of the signing of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. And whenever I glance at the Charter or reread its preamble, I'm always struck by one phrase which the framers of the Charter came up with, which is the dignity and worth of the human person. And that is the phrase which is under peril today. It's under peril today because the pandemic has robbed so many people of their dignity. And in translating the pandemic into the cruel statistics with which we are familiar, when you talk about the thousands upon thousands who have lost their lives, the thousands upon thousands who have lost their livelihoods, the thousands upon thousands who have lost all vestige of hope, then you realize the worth of the human person has also been diminished. But I would argue to you that this is a diminution which has taken place even before the terrible situation we're in today, precisely because we are in a world which we began for as dramatically offensive that as far back as 1972, when we had our first conference on the environment, to 1987, 15 years later, when a landmark commission tried to address and define the concept of sustainable development, to the Rio conference 5 years later, where Pragati was, and its linkage of environment and development, to the World Summit of 2005, when we tried to reframe the phrase enlarge of freedom of the United Nations Charter and see how that could affect our lives, and finally to 2015 and the Sustainable Development Goals and their inevitable link to climate change. And the irony is that, in a sense, this pandemic has really liberated the possibilities of what we saw as realistic in the global climate change scenario. We had aspired to keep global temperatures, to keep them at a level of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And what we saw in just February this year is that the emissions in one of the largest countries with emissions, China, dropped 25%. We saw the global averages of emissions come down 5.5% from 2019. And that's a dramatic figure when you consider that until 2019, the percentage, far from slowing down or decreasing as we had hoped, had actually been increasing. So what the pandemic did, in certainly not the most ideal manner, was to show us the possible. It showed us that we could reduce the 6,000 lives a year that are lost in this country, the United States, to automobile accidents every year, or the 200,000 that are lost every year to atmospheric pollution. But is this the way that we want to prove that what we thought of as possible is possible? I'm so glad that we are joined by students from one of the loveliest countries in the world, the Democratic Republic of Congo, who've joined us from Kinshasa. And I recall last year at the General Assembly, President Tshisekedi had spoken, and he had some very compelling metaphors. He said that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are 80 million hectares of arable land. There is water in the DRC. And between this land and the water, they could take care of the new food and water needs of 2 billion people. All they needed was to adapt climate change to their requirements and to put themselves forward on the goal. 50% of the DRC is covered in forests. And that brings you, in Kinshasa, the question, where are you going to strike the balance? Are you going to preserve that forest cover of 50%? Or are you going to make compromises and use some of that, deforest it, and create industry? There are no easy answers to this. And I hope that when you think about this, you will not be bound by what many of us in our generation have been trapped by, of feeling a moral or ethical impulse without looking at the practical and immediate consequences. Because all that we do at the United Nations, and all that Medard and Wayne do in GEM and in labs like this, is to reconcile the idealistic with the necessary. Democratic has an of 17. That's the age of Greta Thunberg. So you are a country of activists, of possible activists, but also, I would like to say, possible and hopeful rationalists. So there are no easy answers. And what is true of you in the DRC is true for our friends who've joined us from Vietnam, from Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan, from India, from Canada, and of course within the United States. Vietnam, when we look at the one index that we had until now of global health, the surest indicator was maternal mortality. And when we realized that in Vietnam, there are only 43 deaths per 100,000 women who are expecting or delivering, is a commendable average. When we realized in Vietnam, the emissions per capita are 2.1 tons, as against the ideal threshold of 5 tons, we realize that is creditable. So here we have the potential. We have statistics for us, we have facts for us, but above all, we have hope for us. And my only concluding thought is, if we want to realize hope, we have to do that with facts, with reason, but above all, with solidarity. We are not 193 countries. We are one United Nations. Thank you for being a part of that. Thank you, Wayne.